author, speaker, journalist. He served in the British Ministry of Defense as their point man investigating UFOs. You've seen him on nearly every TV show that's ever been done about UFOs. I don't know if he loves or hates this nickname, but he is known pretty much around the world as the real Fox Mulder. Our guest today is Nick Pope. Nick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's just dive into it. I don't want to take up your whole day. So today's topic that we want to address in broad terms is government secrecy. And I'm not just talking about the American government. When it comes to the subject of UFOs, unidentified aerial phenomena, a term that the British government came up with, I believe. Your first book was called Open Skies, Closed Minds. And for anybody watching, if you are interested in this topic at all, if you have not read this book, go get it, because I devoured it and you will really enjoy it. The government of Great Britain has released a lot of documents about investigations that were done, reports that were filed. But that happened largely after you came onto the scene. Was that a big change for the British government? Did they used to be more secretive? And was, in your opinion, there a point where they decided, well, we're going to be more open and have more disclosure?
Well, I think people are maybe surprised to find out that the United Kingdom got its Freedom of Information Act comparatively late compared to, say, for example, the United States. The legislation came in the year 2000, and the act didn't come fully into force until 2005. Now, my time on the Ministry of Defense's UFO program was 1991 to 1994. So if people will forgive me for saying so, I was fortunate enough not to be doing that job without having to look over my shoulder all the time and think, my goodness, all of this is going to come out. So eventually it would. We had something called the 30-year rule, which was part of the old Public Record Act. But I mean, that's essentially what it says. These files wouldn't come out until 30 years after a particular file was closed. So I'm not saying we could do it with impunity, but yeah, absolutely. There was more secrecy, and then we got the act and everything changed, not just for UFOs, but of course, across the board and within the government. With the Ministry of Defense, of course, was almost the most secretive of the departments simply because of the amount of highly classified information that we handled.
So when you were doing that, like when you put your book out, that was 1996, or it was in the 90s. That was well before this was all allowed. Did you find yourself receiving any pushback perhaps from public officials, like maybe you shouldn't be talking about this?
There was some pushback, but all my books, not just Open Skies, Closed Minds, but even my more recent books, and even actually my thrillers, had to go through the British government's security vetting process, and which I willingly did to make sure I didn't inadvertently disclose any classified information. But yes, absolutely, there was some pushback at the time. And perhaps the only reason I was able to get my early books through the system was the fact that we had just had a situation where various former special forces soldiers had written books about the Persian Gulf War. And of course, it would have sent a very odd message to have even reluctantly cleared those books and not to clear a book on UFOs.
Well, you had a lot of topics to discuss. One of your later books, and I will also recommend that to our viewers, was about the Rendlesham Forest incident. You wrote an entire book on that long before a lot of other people were talking about it. Just to give us an example to understand how much transparency there was with the British government, did they want to really talk about that, do you think, or was that something that there wasn't a lot of transparency about?
They didn't really want to talk about it, and if they did, they wanted to dismiss the whole thing as I did when I was sitting there doing that job, in a sort of one-sentence soundbite where we dismissed the whole phenomenon as being of no defense significance. Now, actually, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, which I co-wrote with two of the main witnesses, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, that book, so far as I'm aware, is the only book on this subject that has ever had to be cleared, not just by the United States government, but British government too, because, of course, this was a UFO incident involving United States Air Force personnel, but on British soil. So a bureaucratic nightmare there. We had to get it through not just the Ministry of Defense in the UK, but the Department of Defense in the US. Yeah, they probably didn't want to say much, but I think John, Jim, and myself are all loyal citizens, wouldn't dream of saying anything that would jeopardize national security. And we wanted to play a completely straight bat on this and be upfront and honest with our respective governments on what we wanted to do. None of us characterize ourselves as whistleblowers. We are simply people, hopefully, using our respective government backgrounds, and in their case, military backgrounds, to give people what is, I hope, a sort of informed insider's opinion of this. An insight, as it were, insiders looking out rather than outsiders looking in.
Well, that makes sense. By the way, for all of our viewers, I will include links to both Nick's book and some other information on Rendlesham, on the odd chance you're not aware of it, because it's one of the more famous incidents in history. When you talk about not wanting to endanger national security, things like that, that plays very well into the next question I had for you. Would it be fair to say, both for you individually, as someone who worked with the British government, and perhaps even crossing over to what we'll get into later with the American government, would it be fair to say that there is more information that the British government and the American government have on the subject of UFOs that is not being released? And could you perhaps speculate a little bit about incidents where it's totally justifiable to keep these things secret, or are there some things that maybe should be more transparent that are not being made transparent by both the governments?
Well, I think to take your first question, yes, there is always more. What we're seeing is not the complete picture. I think the British government has been fairly transparent and open about this. We have declassified and released to the National Archives around about 60,000 pages of documents dating, frankly, from the 40s, some old, even Second World War reports of so-called Foo Fighters. So from the 40s through to comparatively modern times, 60,000 pages of documents, some of which were classified very high level, secret, UK eyes only, that sort of thing. The US government as well, to be fair, I'm less conversant with, of course, what the holdings are, but certainly most of the historical Project Blue Book archive is in the public domain. What we don't have, of course, is some of the information about the Pentagon's ATIP program, the US Navy encounters and such like, and we can get on to that. But I think, look, some of these redactions, and certainly now I'm talking again about the British government, some of the redactions are fairly innocuous. I mean, literally, if you go through the British government's UFO files at the National Archives, a lot of the material that's been blacked out is simply names and addresses of witnesses or of officials in the Ministry of Defense. And by the way, of course, I wrote quite a lot of these documents myself. So that's some of it. Another part of it is information which, if disclosed, would perhaps endanger methods and sources of uncovering information. Think it could be something like how good our military radar systems are, something like that, or whether we are or are not able to penetrate communications from certain other nations, that sort of thing. I think elsewhere, more generally, when you look at UFO secrecy, it's clear to me that the real reason for UFO secrecy, most times, I think there's twofold. Firstly, frankly, it's embarrassment that there's something in our airspace. We track it on radar. We occasionally chase it in military jets, film it with forward-looking infrared camera, and its speeds and maneuvers seem to be in excess of anything we've got. That's not really an admission you want to make, not just actually out of embarrassment, but you probably don't want to let on to the Russians or the Chinese either. Well, we are where we are with that. The other side of UFO secrecy, I think, is technology acquisition. And I think we've learned a little bit more about that, for example, through the ATIP program and through some of the material that has been declassified there. Whatever we are dealing with here, whatever the true nature of the UFO phenomenon, there are technological spin-offs that can be derived from a better understanding of it. And frankly, whether it's extraterrestrial, whether it's Russian or Chinese, whether it's some sort of exotic atmospheric plasma phenomenon. And the nation that first figures out how to do that is, I think, going to have a great advantage. And so obviously you don't necessarily, in a situation where lots of nations are looking at this, you don't want to show the other players at the table what hand of cards you are holding.
I would agree with that. You've tipped off another great question that I had on the table that I'll take out of order. I personally am one of those people who don't think we could definitively say that some of the things we've seen, for instance, in the American Navy videos, we can't definitively say that means, oh, there's extraterrestrials. There are a lot of theories out there, but the fact is we just don't know. But do you really think that I could see how any nation, America, United Kingdom, anywhere else, if they had a hold of that and they thought it gave them an advantage, they wouldn't want to reveal it, at least the technical details. But what I wanted to ask you was, if they suspected, maybe not even knew, but strongly suspected, that it wasn't the Russians, it wasn't the Chinese, it wasn't the British, it wasn't the Americans, would it really be that damaging to have someone come out and say, we don't know, it might be the extraterrestrial hypothesis? Or do you think the government, some governments at least, are afraid that saying that would just freak people out and cause some sort of a panic?
I'm not sure in this day and age, particularly with coronavirus, that it would. And frankly, you don't shock people by telling them something that a large proportion of them already believe. So, in fact, I think if governments were to say, look, we haven't ruled out the fact that this could be extraterrestrial, I think a lot of people would say, fair enough. And, pretty much you could argue, reading between the lines, that's almost what the Department of Defense has said. They have said that these objects, these mystery objects that we have the films of from the US Navy, remain unidentified. Therefore, arguably, just by simple deductive reasoning, one could say they cannot really have taken the extraterrestrial hypothesis on the table. I think there's a problem with coming out and saying that, which is why they don't articulate it in quite those terms. And that would be the fact that you get back into the situation where you would tip the hand, say, of the Russians and the Chinese. And you would have a situation where they were saying, well, wow, if that is the best assessment, then this might be real, and we'd better really pile resources into this and make sure we're the nation that gets that tech first. Now, and when I say, I use the phrase best current assessment, the US government says that these things remain unidentified, but there will be a best current assessment. I know that from my own experience of briefing senior folks. You don't go in and just say, I don't know. They expect you to have all the theories evaluated according to the usual processes. Which of them are likely, which of them are unlikely, and which amongst the competing theories is effectively your favorite.
I can't disagree with any of that. Getting back to the whole secrecy question, recently, as I'm sure I already know that you're well aware, the government did officially release 3 videos very recently, but they were ones that anyone who follows this topic had already seen going back to 2017 or 2018. 2 questions. Why do you think they did that? And I'm going to ignore what their stated reason was. And second of all, I'm sure you're familiar with former Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, who commented on them quickly. And he used the phrase that he was glad to see the videos released, but he said this only scratches the surface of what we know. So I guess that's a two-parter, but what's your interpretation of what would motivate the Pentagon to release that? And if Harry Reid, who was very heavily involved in all of this, believes or knows, up to you, that there's a lot more information, are we moving towards a situation where maybe they're going to be reviewing this and saying, oh, there's probably more stuff we could tell you?
Sure. Let me take the first question first. Why did the Pentagon release this information officially when, frankly, it had been out there for 2.5 years already? I think the answer to that question, I don't know, but I think my take on it is that all governments across pretty much all subjects actually want to be in the driving seat. They want to be driving the narrative. You want to be proactive, not reactive. So I think what we saw was the Pentagon putting themselves back in the driving seat, putting themselves front and center on this story so that they are controlling the narrative, not reacting to what the New York Times says, not reacting to what the Stars Academy says and does. So I think that's the why. As to Harry Reid, former Senate Majority Leader, of course, who was instrumental in setting up the ATIP program in the first place. I mean, yeah, if he says this is the tip of the iceberg, absolutely. And that's no more than people involved in this program like Lou Elizondo and others have said. And the Navy itself, of course. When the Navy last year updated its guidance on what to do when its own people, its own pilots, for example, encounter these objects, their justification for that, and this was in one of their official responses from public affairs spokespeople, their official justification was this is in response to an ongoing series of incursions into restricted military airspace. So by their own admission, the 3 videos, that's nothing compared to the wider picture of what's going on in our airspace.
Fair enough. There's a lot of interest going on in the media, among the public, at least in my opinion. I monitor these things, and there's a lot more discussion going on than just what the governments are talking about. One good example that I wanted to touch on because I've been enjoying it so much is you have a new series, relatively new, well, second season of a new series called The Basement Files that you've been doing with the New York Post. Could you just give us a brief look at how did that come about and what are you trying to do with that?
Sure. Well, it's the basement office. And
I'm sorry, I apologize. Basement office.
No yes. problem. It was the brainchild of Stephen Greenstreet, who's a filmmaker, but he now works for the Post on video content. And he has had a sighting himself, but he comes to this from the perspective of a journalist and a filmmaker who wanted to contextualize his own sighting and do a series. And what he said was he wanted this in many ways to be the opposite of your average TV show on UFOs. And I'll choose my words carefully because I've probably been involved in some of those shows, but you know the sort of thing I mean. A bunch of people wandering around and somebody points in the sky and says, oh, look at that. What's that? What's that? And And so we really wanted to do something, or he really wanted to do something more, I suppose, fresh and journalistic in its approach. And the original plan was that he would be sitting there and people would Skype in and he would review documents and photographs and films. And then I came into the studio, into the offices of the New York Post to do this. And we really hit it off, and there was a good rapport between us. And he said, you should be sitting at this desk too, and the two of us should do it. So we do this real deep dive into this mix of what's going on right now with the Pentagon's ATIP program, the US Navy, Tic Tac, etc., and some interesting historical cases that perhaps put a lot of this into perspective. And the Basement Office has been this huge left field hit. I mean, the viewing figures have been staggering. I think they count season 2 a different way. But if you look at season 1 on YouTube, some of the individual episodes have got over 1 million views. I think it's different now. I'm not sure it's just counted on YouTube, because a lot of people go direct to the New York Post's website, right, and that doesn't count. But it's really, I've enjoyed doing it, and Stephen Greenstreet has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to work with someone like him, and it really is a smash hit.
Well, I've watched every one of them, and I recommend it to all of our viewers. A lot of good information. You touch even on, as you mentioned, some of the older cases, and I've heard things that, and I'm obsessed with this stuff, and I have been for a very long time. You've covered stuff I never even heard of, so that's a really great resource for people. Aside from the Basement Files, I'm not going to keep you all day. I know you're very busy. What else do you have going on right now where people could keep up with what you're doing? Where can they follow you on social media? What other shows are you working on in various formats? Because I think you're a very valuable resource, and we should have everybody following you.
Well, my website is nickpoe.net, and there are links to my Facebook and Twitter accounts on the front page there. I, of course, continue to be involved with some of the great traditional popular UFO shows. Ancient Aliens is a television institution, of course, now, depending on how you count the seasons. And I say,
what are they in, like the 70th season now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the show has been going over 10 years, and I know in IMDb and History Channel, I think, somewhat confusingly count a different way, but it runs and runs. And I've just done an episode, for example, which was, I think, screened the other day, where for the first time, Dennis Kucinich, who of course was seeking the presidential nomination some years ago, went on the record about this infamous UFO sighting he had at Shirley MacLaine's old house. And he and I went back to that house and we discussed this. And probably, had it not been for coronavirus, that the story of he and I getting together and talking through his encounter would have made a much bigger splash. But Ancient Aliens continues. The Unexplained, of course, continues. That's the show. Yeah, executive produced and fronted by William Shatner. Then the To the Stars folks have their own show out on history, and then there's the new Skinwalker Ranch show. It shows, I think, people are fascinated. Now, I'm not involved in the To the Stars one or the Skinwalker one, but I am involved, obviously, in Ancient Aliens and in some of the episodes, some upcoming episodes, I think, of the Unexplained. So there's a lot out there, but obviously coronavirus has put a lot of the film and TV industry on hold, just as it's put a lot of other things on hold. So I think there's going to be inevitably a little bit of a pause, but I think that as soon as we're out of this and reopening, networks and production companies are going to be scrambling around for new content. And I know I'm one of the people on their radar. So I hope that aside from episodes of things like Ancient Aliens and The Unexplained that have yet to be broadcast, there'll be new shows on the horizon too. I'm working on several ideas. I mean, I can't say much until anything's green lit and formally organized, formally authorized and announced. But yeah, lots of plans, simply because interest in this, I think, is at an all-time high, and this subject really in the last 2.5 years has transitioned out of the fringe and into the mainstream in a way that's quite unprecedented.
I have to agree with the last thing you said, and as new things are greenlit, I will just ask you to make sure you let everybody know through social media or drop me an email or whatever, because there is a great appetite for this. Nick Pope, before we go, this may be uncomfortable. I want to ask you one question, and we'll just make this the exit question, because I know a lot of people are wondering. Were you someone who had a job in the government who got thrust into this unusual topic? Or have you yourself ever had an experience where you saw something you couldn't explain that spurred you on?
I have never seen a UFO. I probably, rather like Luis Elizondo, had, in the course of my career, most of the things I did were not UFO related. I mean, I was in the MOD for 21 years. 3 of those years were spent researching and investigating the UFO phenomenon. So I was recruited into it not because of any interest or personal experience, but simply as part of the normal cycle of government postings. When you, at the time, the policy was you do 3 years thereabouts, and then hopefully you get a promotion at the end of it. If not, you get a level transfer and a crack at something else, and next time round go up for promotion. So yeah, I had no interest in this at all. I came to it with an open mind, blank sheet of paper, and I determined to take a completely data-led approach with it and see where I ended up. And I must say to you, I ended up, I suppose, nowhere I ever expected to be.
Well, now I feel a little bit better, because I have been obsessed with this forever, and I too have never actually seen a UFO. So, Nick Pope, thank you very much for your generosity with your time. We will have in the show notes all the links to all of your material, and best of luck in the future, and we'll keep an eye on what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
You too. Bye now.